Have you ever felt like someone you love might be hiding something? Something you can't quite put your finger on, but it gnaws at the back of your mind? That's exactly how I felt about Nick. We met on a brisk autumn afternoon in Central Park. I was walking my dog, Luna, when she slipped her leash and bolted across the lawn. Out of nowhere, Nick appeared, laughing as he caught her before she could disappear into the trees. He handed her back to me with a smile that made my heart skip a beat. "I guess this means I'm your hero for the day," he joked, his dark eyes sparkling. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. He told me he was a freelance photographer who had just moved to New York from Seattle. I told him about my graphic design job at a small ad agency in Brooklyn. Before we parted, he asked for my number. I gave it to him without hesitation. Our first date was perfect. Nick took me to a cozy cafe in the West Village, where fairy lights twinkled above the outdoor seating. Over lattes and tiramisu, we talked for hours. He seemed to know exactly what to say to put me at ease. But even then, something about him felt off. He had an uncanny way of avoiding personal questions. Whenever I asked about his family or his life in Seattle, he'd steer the conversation back to me. "I'd rather hear about you," he'd say with a smile. It was flattering, but it also left me with more questions than answers. Despite that, I couldn't help but fall for him. Nick was thoughtful, funny, and attentive in a way no one had ever been before. But as the weeks turned into months, those nagging doubts refused to go away. He never invited me to his apartment. He always had an excuse: repairs, a broken elevator, a roommate who worked nights. I brushed it off at first, but eventually it started to bother me. What was he hiding? One evening, while we were having dinner at a trendy restaurant in Soho, I decided to bring it up. "Nick, you've been to my place a dozen times, but I've never even seen where you live. Why is that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth before setting it down. "It's just not a great place right now," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Trust me, you're not missing anything." Something in his voice made it clear he didn't want to discuss it further. I let it drop, but the seed of doubt had been planted. It was during a casual Sunday morning walk through Prospect Park that things took a stranger turn. An older man, dressed in a long coat and carrying a newspaper, stopped abruptly as we passed him. His eyes widened as he looked at Nick. "You look just like—" the man began, his voice trailing off. Nick stiffened. "Sorry, you must be mistaken," he said quickly, grabbing my hand and pulling me away. "What was that about?" I asked once we were out of earshot. "Just a weirdo," he muttered. But his grip on my hand was tighter than usual, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, as I lay awake in bed, the pieces started to form a picture I didn't want to see. Who was Nick, really? After the incident in Prospect Park, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nick was hiding something. The way he had pulled me away, the tension in his voice, it wasn't just embarrassment. It was fear. For the next few days, I tried to push the thought aside, convincing myself I was overreacting. But the curiosity gnawed at me. Finally, late one night, I decided to dig a little deeper. Nick had mentioned being a freelance photographer, so I searched his name online. At first, nothing unusual came up, just a few social media accounts with the typical curated snapshots of New York life. But something about them felt off. His Instagram, for example, was full of photos of landmarks and cityscapes, but there were almost no pictures of him. The captions were vague, never revealing much about his personal life. Then I found an old article from the Seattle Times. It was dated October 15th, 2015, just a few weeks before Nick said he moved to New York. The article was about a missing man named Nicholas Harris, a name that matched his perfectly. The accompanying photo was eerily similar to him, down to the sharp cheekbones and piercing dark eyes. But the article didn't make sense. It described Nicholas Harris as having vanished under unusual circumstances. His apartment had been left untouched, his wallet and keys on the kitchen counter. The only clue was a single photograph found on his coffee table, a black and white picture of an abandoned house in the middle of a dense forest. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Was this my Nick? If it wasn't, the resemblance was uncanny. The next day, I decided to confront him. I invited him over for dinner, something we hadn't done in weeks. He arrived with his usual charm, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. Over dinner, I couldn't bring myself to ask him outright. Instead, I dropped hints, bringing up Seattle and asking if he ever missed it. "Not really," he said casually. "I didn't have much there." "But didn't you grow up there?" I pressed. He hesitated, his fork pausing mid-air. "Why the sudden interest in my past?" I laughed nervously, trying to deflect. "Just curious. You've always been a bit of a mystery." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some things are better left that way." After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting too close to something he didn't want me to know. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m., I found myself scrolling through the old article again, fixating on the photograph mentioned in the piece. Why would someone disappear and leave behind a picture of a house? Before I knew it, I was researching the photo itself. It didn't take long to find a match. An abandoned property deep in the woods near Seattle. The house had a dark history. According to local legends, it was cursed. Everyone who entered either vanished or met a tragic end. I stared at the screen, chills running down my spine. What had Nick gotten himself into? And more importantly, who or what was he now? The next few days were a blur of unease and determination. Every time I saw Nick, my stomach twisted with anxiety. Who was this man I thought I knew? The more I uncovered, the more questions I had. I decided I couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. If Nick was connected to that house, I needed to know why. One evening, as we sat on the couch in my Brooklyn apartment, I finally confronted him. "Nick, I found something," I began, trying to steady my voice. He looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath and pushed forward. "I know about Seattle, about the article in the Seattle Times, about Nicholas Harris." For a moment, his face went blank. Then he leaned back, a strange calmness washing over him. "You've been busy," he said softly. "Who are you, Nick?" I demanded. "Are you even the same person from that article? Or is this some kind of sick game?" He sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me," I shouted, unable to hold back the frustration and fear any longer. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he spoke. "I am Nicholas Harris," he admitted. "But I'm not the man who disappeared in 2015. "What does that even mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood and began pacing the room. "When I entered that house in the woods, I thought it was just an urban legend, a story to scare people. But something was inside, something ancient." "Nick, you're not making any sense," I said, my heart racing. "It's hard to explain," he replied, stopping to look at me. "The house doesn't just trap people, it changes them. I don't know how long I was in there, but when I came out, I wasn't the same." I stared at him, struggling to process his words. "What do you mean you weren't the same? You're sitting here, alive. How is that possible?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window and gazed out at the city lights. After I left that house, I realized something was wrong. I couldn't remember parts of my life. My reflection in the mirror didn't feel like mine. And then there were the changes. Changes? He turned to face me, his expression haunted. "I don't get sick. I don't age. And sometimes I feel like something else is inside me." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say, but Nick wasn't finished. "You need to understand," he said, his voice urgent. "Whatever's in that house doesn't let go. It follows you. And now that you know about it, it's only a matter of time before it finds you too. My blood turned cold. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to stay away from me, he said, his voice breaking. It's the only way to keep you safe. But before I could respond, the room grew eerily quiet. The hum of the city outside faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Nick's face paled. It's here. What's here? I whispered, but I already knew the answer. A shadow began to form in the corner of the room, growing taller and darker until it consumed the light. The air turned icy, and a voice, low and inhuman, filled the space. You cannot run from me, Nicholas, it said. Nick stepped in front of me, shielding me from the presence. You won't take her, he shouted. The shadow lunged, and everything went black.